Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Before we launch into the language game, I want to thank our sponsor, Next Estate. Next Estate are specialists for the English-speaking market in the German market for buying, selling, and managing properties. You can find Next Estate at next-estate.com or next-estate.de. Speaking of language, let's get into the language game. In today's book, our guests outline a revolutionary perspective that overhauls almost everything we thought we knew about language. We will hear how the game of charades reveals deep insights into how language works. We'll hear how our brain can improvise linguistic moves at an astonishingly rapid rate. We'll hear how languages are in continual flux, how people without a common tongue can rapidly create a language from scratch, and why it's likely that language has been independently reinvented countless times. We will also realize how the creation of language is not only important in itself, it also changed the nature of evolution. That's just a taste of the many topics that we'll cover today in this magnificent book. The story of language is the story of humanity. The new understanding of language that our guests outline in this book radically revises our conception of ourselves. It's a great pleasure to welcome the author of this magnificent book, Nick Chater and Morten Christiansen, authors of The Language Game. Welcome to the show.
Wonderful to be here.
It's great to have you on the show. And one of the things you talk about in the book is that our brains became bigger than other mammals. But one of the things I was saying to you off air before we came on is, unfortunately, our attention span is becoming less and less. And I thought we'd start, before we go on a deep dive into the book and the topics that you cover, those revolutionary topics that I mentioned in the introduction, that we'd start with, what's the big idea that you're proposing in the book for those people whose attention wanes and don't join us for the entire discussion?
Well, one of the things that we focus on in the book is the fact that language is fundamentally collaborative, and that in many ways, the way we've looked at language before is that people have been looking at it in ways that treat language more as monologue rather than dialogue. And the fact is that we are very collaborative and improvisational when we are interacting with one another. And it's that interaction that we have with one another that's sort of fundamental to how we use language, how language have allowed us to become the most powerful creature on earth, for better and worse.
And just to amplify that point about improvisation, the key metaphor in the book, which Aidan's also already mentioned, is this metaphor of charades. And so when we're playing charades, we're gesturing, we're trying to get across some idea of the moment to make you think of King Kong or whatever. Feel more have in mind by some sort of bizarre sort of waving of the arms. And it's obvious when we're doing that the process is clearly very variable from one person to the next, from one situation to the next. It is an improvisation. But on the other hand, it's still a very effective way of getting information across. And the thing about charades is that it makes it clear that we're incredibly clever sort of communicative problem solvers. You've got a challenge, which is gone with the wind. You think, how on earth do I do that? I mean, how do I wind the wind? Oh, well, and you think of something, or maybe you take a scene from the movie, or whatever it is, and you can do that in a really, really creative, open-ended way. And I think when we tend to think about language, going back to Morten's point about monologue, and also to some extent written language, we tend to think that language is a fixed system. Whereas when we're playing charades, we're not dealing with a fixed system, because we're creating it in the moment. But of course, if we play charades many times with the same person, we start to use the same conventions. You think, oh, well, I did King Kong before, so now I've got to do something Planet of the Apes. Well, I can do that and get the ape thing across, and now we've got to do the Earth or something. So I can use conventions that we just made up a moment ago and reuse them. And as you play more and more with the same person, of course, you're going to do that in a ever richer, more complicated way. And the insight, I think, that underpins the book is that you should see the process of creating a language, both within parent-child interactions, but also within a community of speakers, essentially as an endless and ever more elaborate game of charades where the conventions are getting ever richer and ever deeper. And of course, in practice, when a new child comes into the world, they're not starting their charade play from scratch. They're coming into a community where we've already built a lot of conventions. But the open-ended improvisational nature of that process of creating those conventions is still going. It's still open-ended. We're still using creativity and problem solving to get a message across and thinking, oh no, but hang on, but language now, it's not like that. It's a completely rigid system of conventions. Every word has a meaning. The words have grammar rules and they all fit together in a perfect harmony. We can write them all down. That's really a mistake. It's a complex, continually evolving open-ended system of improvisations, which is ultimately a product of human collaborativeness and inventiveness.
I was laughing at that, Nick, when I read that about how in charades, or charades as we'd say here in Ireland, you build on, you establish a term. And I actually remember playing Gone with the Wind at Christmas time with my own family. And at the time, my father had a bit of a flatulence problem. And every time wind came up later on, we just point to him and everybody built on it. So I absolutely got the point when you talked about building on conventions. But one of the really interesting things you start the book is with this scene. So you bring us to the scene. There's even an image of this scene where Captain Cook and his crew land and have to communicate with the house hunter-gatherers. And this really sets the scene beautifully.
Yeah, so this was at the time when Captain Cook was charged with going around South America to Tahiti, where they were going to observe the transit of Venus. And they needed to get some water and some firewood on the way. So they stopped in at the very tip of South America at Tierra del Fuego. And when they went ashore, they saw some native inhabitants, but they withdrew. But then not long after, they came back again. And then two men from Captain Cook's crew went forward on their own. And then two people from the house also came forward. But very interestingly, they had some sticks and they sort of held them out in front of them and threw them aside. And Captain Cook and his men, they took that as indication that the house, that they were probably, that's what we think they were. It's not entirely clear, but they probably were a band of a house indigenous people. They took the fact that they threw away the stakes as an indication that they had friendly intention. And indeed, that was actually the case. So very soon thereafter, they were exchanging gifts, and some of the house even came aboard ship on the HMS Endeavour. And essentially, they were playing sort of a game of high stakes cross-cultural charades, even though they had no common language and they looked really different from one another. For the house, the European must just look very strange in their sort of waistcoats and all their fine regalia. And likewise, the house looked very odd to the Europeans as well. Yet they were able to find sort of part of this common humanities, some common ground, so that they could communicate with one another. And the house helped Cook and his men find fresh water and so on. And they were sort of together for a few days, and then Captain Cook went off. And so really that's sort of a nice sort of illustration of what we can do even if we have no common language. And of course, normally when we do have a common language, we have so much more power in our ability to play charades linguistically and even non-linguistically.
I love that story because it really shows that we can form a language. And again, I thought again about the conventions that you built. So once they've built a convention, they'll refer to it again. And that's how rapidly we can acquire language. And we're really adaptable in that way. And later on, we'll talk about some of the amazing stories you talk about of actually developing language, even though if you're blind, deaf and dumb, you can still find a way to communicate with people. But let's build on the idea of language as charades, because I thought that we shared the thought experiment that you mentioned by Michael Tomasello.
Yes, so he had a very, I think, good intuition that if we imagine we had two different islands, and so let's call where we have a set of children. So on one island, you have children that can only use manual gestures, but not speak. And then on the other island, we have children that can only speak, but not use gestures. Or rather, they cannot really speak because they have no language, but they can just vocalize. And so one island we can call Gesture Island. The other island we can call Vocalization Island. And what what Tomasello was thinking is that if these children, imagine they got food and so on, but there was nobody to teach them how to communicate, they could quickly, on the gesture island, they could use gestures to indicate sort of, go that way, or this is how we cook things and so on. But he was reasoning that I think intuitive for a lot of people that might sort of make sense, that on vocalization island, if they couldn't use gestures, they wouldn't really be able to communicate much, apart from maybe sort of indicate sort of fear or cry and something like that. However, Marcus Perlman created a competition called the Vocalization Challenge, where there was actually a prize where you had people from around the world try to create sounds made by the human vocal apparatus, but no speech sounds, for a variety of different concepts, such as tiger, water, a number of other things. And then he would take all these entries and then play them to people that then had to guess whether it referred to a picture of, say, a knife or water or a tiger and so on. And people could do this really well. And then he did it even across the world and found that people around the world were able to guess which was which, indicating that even in our vocal apparatus, we actually have the ability to create sounds that can sort of, in our minds, give us the idea of what it's actually referring to. So language can both use gestures to indicate meaning, but also the sounds themselves.
It's so interesting because intuitively, and exactly what Tomasello was trading on, this intuition, a very reasonable intuition it is, intuitively it feels to most of us that the iconicity of gesture is the ability to, as it were, trait something that resembles the target is greater with gesture than it is with sound. It feels like if I want to, I can play out an action with my hands. I can mime throwing something, or I can mime grinding a pepper mill. And similarly, maybe I can pretend to be an animal. But it turns out that we're actually pretty good at that vocally as well. So if you took that intuition at face value and thought gesture is better at doing these kind of iconic representations where the signal is supposed to resemble the thing it's going to refer to, then you might think, well, it must be the case then that languages start off being gestural and only become vocal later on. But the Perlman work suggests it's not so straightforward as that. Actually, vocal gesturing is itself very, very flexible and iconic, and we can do wonderful glug sounds and grinding sounds and cutting sounds and all kinds of peculiar things, which actually make acoustical communication pretty flexible too. So I think there's a big debate in the language evolution field, which is going to be a very hard debate ever really to resolve for sure, which is concerns the question of whether a language started initially as gestural and then became gradually more vocal, or whether it's always been both, or it started primarily vocal. But I think it's much less clear than one might imagine. But the charades story, although of course charades is itself gestural, our charades story is really a story about this process of going from the momentary improvised iconic kind of communication to this more systematic set of conventions. So we're not taking a stand on that. That's not our that's not our area of expertise, and I suspect it's going to be very hard to tease it out. But it's actually surprising, as Morten says, how amazingly good we are at acoustic charades, essentially.
And I think if we think of language and communication as a kind of way of solving communicative problems at the moment, it makes sense that probably originally we might have used, or humans or early homonyms might have used both sound and gesture, simply because that gives you the most chances for being understood and solving the communicative challenges of the moment.
So one of the things I mentioned in the intro, guys, was the idea that this is a revolutionary approach. The idea of language as charades or charades is, I'm building on your convention now, Nick, of charades.
You may just
I throw my own charades out the window. But the idea, one of the ideas that's kind of, as a result, kind of thrown to the wayside, or at least uprooted, was the transmission model as described by Claude Shannon. And it's probably worthwhile sharing what that is to our audience and why then the language of charades uproots that.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I could say a little bit about that. So the sort of traditional idea, which I think is very intuitive, is that I have a thought in my head. I want to get that thought into your head. So I turn my thought into words, and the words essentially encapsulate the thought. So it's like a message in a bottle. I put my thought into some words. I send a little bottle of words across to you. Then you think, oh, what does this mean? I have a read, turn it back into a thought. Aha, we've got it. So that from that point of view, what we need from a language is a way of encoding and decoding thoughts. So it's like a code. It's like a code challenge, really. Of course, with codes, normally we often want to make them secret and hard to crack. Here, we want to make them easy to crack. I want to get my message across to you as easily as possible. But that's, I think, a very misleading perspective, because it suggests that the code is a sort of fixed thing. There's a sort of fixed way of taking thoughts and turning them into words and turning them back again. And actually, of course, that is a way that for many years people have tried to do natural language understanding. It's not necessarily the way it's done now, but in computers, the starting point assumption was, well, we need some sort of understanding of the logical form of thoughts. We need to then be able to turn them into words in some systematic way and build an algorithm to do that. And then we need to have another algorithm to go the other way. Now, the charades perspective, and I'm having an urge to say charades now because I'm being entrained by you, Aidan, and Morten's another charades person as well. So it's all good. The charades perspective makes one think instead, no, of course, there's no fixed. You don't need a fixed code which says, this part of the code means this. In fact, the very same gesture. So, might at one moment be trying to get across King Kong, or if we're dealing with got some part of Gone with the Wind. So it might be the same gesture. Might be I'm gesturing at this film, or it might be your poor father or uncle, whoever it was, with his digestive challenges, or it might be some very abstract conception of wind in some meteorological context, or anything else. And in reality, the thing we're always doing, this goes back to the dialogue and point as well, we're trying to communicate in a particular situation. So I've got a particular challenge right now here in front of me. I want you to act in some way, or catch on to something I'm thinking. So I'm going to use some words which will push you in the right direction. It's not that there's a standardized solution to the problem. It's like, in this situation, given what we just said, I think doing a King Kong arm waving action is going to do the trick. That'll make you think monkeys or something, and that's what I want, because I want Planet of the Apes. Or apes aren't monkeys. So I'm trying to push you in a particular direction and get you down that channel in this particular moment. But similarly, in daily life, we're always talking about, can you pass the cup? And you might think, with the code view, you think, cup. Now, what exactly is a cup? Let's try and really nail that down. And of course, in a way, we've had more than centuries really, of philosophy trying to figure out, is there really such a thing as an essence of a cup? I mean, a Platonic ideal. Or if it's not ideals, is there a definition? Or there must be something that pins down what we mean when we're using the code, as it were, the code word cup. Whereas from a charades perspective, that's just not right at all. Cup is just whatever's good enough. It can be used in whatever way you like, as long as it's good enough to pick out the thing that I care about in the moment. So if I have a bunch of mugs, and I don't care which one you give me, if I say pass me a cup, that's fine. You're just going to pass me a mug. If there are cups and mugs, then if I want a mug, I better say mug. Otherwise, I'm going to get a cup. And if there are cups which are prizes, like sort of winning a cup in, the football or something, then I've got to distinguish between that kind of cup and a mug, which may not be necessary, because it may be obvious I'm wanting a cup of coffee, or it may be that I'm at a prize ceremony, so passing the cup is obviously not going to get very far if you try and hand over a cup of coffee. But the situation will often do the work for us. But the key point is that it doesn't ultimately, the communication doesn't ultimately depend on there being a fixed code underneath everything. I think that the revolution, in a sense, is that once upon a time, with the code model in mind, one thinks, yes, okay, there's all this contextual stuff that helps you use language in flexible ways, but deep down, there's a core meaning to every word, and there's a core way in which all the words fit together, and then you can do a bit of clever stuff on top of that. But the charades perspective makes you think, no, that's totally wrong. There's no core meaning to throwing down some sticks. There's no core meaning to waving your arms in the air, and there isn't in language too. Each time you use a communicative gesture, you're going to trade on the gestures you used before. But that's not to say that ultimately we can say, really, deep down, that word means this, or the grammatical rules are these. That's never becomes crystallized or crystal clear. It doesn't have to, because in fact, it's the open-ended, ingenious nature of human communication allows us to continually twist and change the way we mean, the way meanings work, in a way that works with the situation we're in at the moment.
And also, following on this is that on the one hand, the idea of language as a rate also captures the flexibility of language on the one hand, but also one of the problems with the sort of transmission model is that language becomes very brittle because that's very thin signal that goes across from one mind to the other. And in fact, Claude Shannon was very concerned about noise on this channel. That's what his theory was all about, how you can try to deal with that. Because he was really coming up with this idea of transmission information theory in terms of trying to figure out how essentially phone conversation could be improved and so on. That's what he was working on a long, long time ago. And in fact, in his original work, he specifically noted that meaning has nothing to do with it, whereas when from the viewpoint of language as you rate, meaning has everything to do with it. That's the primary goal that we are trying to get across. We're trying to get some ideas across in some way or another. And so in that way, what really becomes important is that words and phrases and sentences are just cues or clues to what we are trying to say. But it's the collaborative nature of we are trying to say something, you're trying to sort of unpack that, but also we need to take the audience into account. So just like when you're making a podcast, when you're talking to people and when you're sort of trying to talk, you need to think about what does the audience know, what does the audience not know, and you need to take that into account. So in a sense, when you're doing a podcast, you are collaborating with the audience in terms of trying to present whatever information you're trying to present in the way that makes the most sense to them, given their background, given what they're likely to know and not know.
I'm going to jump right to the end of the book and then come back because you teed us up nicely for Shannon, and essentially it was almost like a mechanistic way of studying language versus a humanistic way. One of the problems with the mechanistic way is that it also suggests that we're like computers, but like computers with random access memory, they can hold only a certain amount of working memory at any one time to be used. And that's why we get this scroll wheel of death on the computer. But in a similar sense, we can only hold a certain amount of language or of information in working memory at any one time. Hence the Miller paper, 1956, the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. So that leads us to the now or never bottleneck, this funnel of information that we have that can get clogged up. So I'm going to pause that for a moment because we'll come back to that in a second. And I'm going to jump right to the end of the book because you kind of alluded to this about the cups, the different types of cups versus mugs versus an award. One of the really interesting things you talked about is that how language can shape perception. And I found this absolutely fascinating and very interesting for the audience of this show. Because if, for example, you're the leader in an organization, the language you choose and making that language accessible to your audience and depending on who you're talking to. So I'm saying, for example, as I'm the leader of the organization and I'm talking to the team that's building a new business model, I'm going to speak and communicate to them very differently than I would to the legacy organization, because if I speak to them in the same way, they might become competitors, and actually as a result, the organization suffers. Mm-hmm. And I was really interested by later on in the book where you talked about, say in Greek has different words for light blue and dark blue, versus me in English, it's just, I call it dark blue or light blue. And if I'm learning a language that way, that becomes interesting. And how across different regions and different nationalities and different tribes, people have different languages for different colors. Some don't even have language for some colors. That is absolutely mind-blowing. And the fact that language can shape perception is really important to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start on that one. I mean, I think in psychology, there's been this debate going back, and not that much less than a century now, about whether the way in which language shapes perception. It's been a very sort of fractious debate. Because on the one hand, you have people who say, well, of course, the way you use language changes everything about thought. It changes the way you see the world. It changes the way you conceptualize the world. And that's one one perspective, especially associated with linguists Sapir and Benjamin Whorf. And on the other hand, you have psychologists saying, oh, no, language is, going back to the code perspective, actually, language is really a secondary thing. The thinking is primary, and you just translate your thoughts into language. So the language really doesn't matter very much. And there's a big sort of space in between those two perspectives, which I think is a space we want to inhabit, which is to say, well, when you think about it, if you, again, take the charades perspective, the ability, the language doesn't shape thought insofar as if you have a new challenge, a new situation, a new thing to communicate about, you can create some language to do it. Now, you've got this amazing creative potential. So if you're dealing with an organization in flux and there's some new challenge you face and you haven't quite got the words for the different parts of the organization or the different products even, or the different kind of target audiences, which might be continually fracturing and changing, you can rethink that all the time. And we see that, of course, in technology. We're always creating new words, and we're doing that in the arts, continually inventing words for new musical styles, just new ways of doing things generally, new styles of cookery. And we're continual creators. And even when we're using existing words, we're using them in different ways. So it's not that language is a kind of prison that you're stuck in, but on the other hand, depending on what conventions you've laid down, what charades you've played so far, it makes it so much easier to communicate some things than other things. So if I live in a world where there's already two words for light and dark blue, then to me that's very obvious, very salient. And in fact it does, there are very interesting experiments to show this, it does mean that when I see a light or a dark blue, I classify them as much more fundamentally different than if I'm in a language like English, where I don't see them as different. And you can see that in terms of actual brain activity. So it's not just that that's going on because I'm thinking secretly, I'm thinking, oh, green, oh, blue, or oh, light blue. It's not that you're hearing, as it were, traces of the words flowing through my head. And that's been very cleverly shown with a number of neat experiments. But so the ease with which you can think things, that's what language is really changing. It's like you think of language for a moment like a tool, a communicative tool, or a very open-ended communicative toolbox. The toolbox is very generative. You can always create new tools from your old tools, and you can do that indefinitely. But having a tool lying around, that really changes everything. So if we're trying to communicate with each other, we don't have the right tools to make it easy, we're going to get in a tremendous pickle. So finding the right tools is very crucial, but also understanding, as it were, the toolbox of the other person and having a sense of how are we able to commonly understand the predicament we're in. So a classic you see, of course, in organizational context is when one company takes another over. Then there's all kinds of clashes about the ways in which things are talked about and people are referred to, and even just the kind of style of language people use. So that we have formality or informality or all these things, or vocabulary. You may even have charades type clashes, and if you do clash on that, if you're in a kind of organizational takeover context, that might be a sign of a real difficulty, because you think, there they are with their charades versus their charades. We have a charades. They're just being difficult just to be for the sake of it. So you can even get these linguistic differences themselves becoming, as it were, symbolic of dissonance. So trying to find a harmonious, common way of classifying the world, which is always open-ended and always changing, but finding that is really critical, I think, in successfully, not just successfully communicating, but successfully allowing people to work harmoniously together in just about any context, really.
And that also becomes particularly important when you consider companies that work across multiple countries where they speak different languages. So actually having some knowledge of these other languages, that can give you insight into some subtle cultural aspects that can be important for having sort of very smooth organizational sort of interactions and so on. So it's oftentimes underappreciated just how much you can learn about another culture from being able to speak the language. And so, so this is also a good argument for knowing more than one language in many cases, especially if you're working with companies that are working internationally as well.
Thank you for entertaining that as well, because I think it's so interesting, and why the book is so interesting, I found, for transformational change in any sense, because understanding, as you said, the language of the recipient is so important, because that's who you're really talking about. One of the studies you talked about was that famous builder architect experiment where you have to communicate how to build something from the other side, and the most important language to speak in is of the builder, not the architect. And I often think about how leaders in organizations speak from their perspective, and it's almost like message sent, that's job done, but it's actually about message received. Maybe you'll share that famous study as well, because this is really important to understand.
Yes, so there's very interesting work done by a variety of people, but especially strongly associated with Herb Clark at Stanford. And Herb's done lots of experiments where you get people to do things along the following lines. So, one person has got to, let's say, we're needing not with construction in the first instance, but recognizing patterns. So one person has a bunch of tangrams. So these are these triangular shapes that you can build into little funny pictures. So they have a stack of tangrams in front of them, and they've got to pick one of those tangrams out. So that's the one that I want you to choose. The other person can see the same set of tangrams, but I can't just point. I've got to describe. So I've got to say, what is it what is special about my tangram? And they all are just essentially arbitrary geometric patterns, just triangles laid on top of each other in peculiar ways. Luckily, though, the human visual system is rather good at thinking, oh, that one looks a bit like a Christmas tree, or that's kind of like a rocket. So pretty soon, after doing quite a lot of this, you start to develop a vocabulary for different kinds of tangrams, and so things like the guy leaning against the tree or the rocket or whatever become standardized things we can get very quick. And of course, the same thing applies if we're trying to get someone to create something. So if we're trying to get them to build a tangram or build something out of Lego or maybe build some IKEA furniture, they have the same challenge. So I know what it's supposed to look like. I know what you're supposed to be building, but I've got to tell you. So now, instead of picking out a set of options, you've got to go through a sequence of instructions. That's a sequence of stages to create the target. And I can see you doing it and thinking, oh, no, that's not what I meant. So I've got to go back and so on. But what's remarkable about those processes is that we are actually astonishingly good at them. We're amazingly flexible. People are extremely good at reformulating what they've said. So they'll say something and it goes wrong. They say, no, think about it this way, think about it that way. So they'll find ways of backing up, uncovering common assumptions, thinking, I thought when I said that, I thought I meant this, but you picked up this other thing. Oh, well, I'm now going to reformulate and change that. So it's amazingly fluid. Another set of very interesting experiments along the same lines is done by a team involving Simon Garrett and Tony Sanford and others in Glasgow, where they look at maps. So here, you've got a challenge of one person's, both people can see a map. One person knows a route that they want the other person to follow, and they've got to describe it, and the other person's got to follow the route. But the devious trick they use is that they make the maps different. So there is actually a flaw in the correspondence, and they do that because then they want people to struggle, and they want to look at how people deal with those struggles. And it's pretty hard for people to think, hang on. So you're saying at the T junction, then to the left there's a tree, and then to the right there's a blue square, but I'm not seeing that. And then gradually people can with a lot of effort untangle. Hey, we're seeing a different world. This is not the same thing, or we're seeing things differently. And there's a whole world of these tasks. That the upshot of all of it is that that people are amazingly flexible collaborators, and I think everyone comes out of one of these tasks feeling very foolish. That as a subject, certainly if you've ever done one, you think, I was hopeless. I tried to communicate this and I didn't quite get it. And but as an experimenter, you are astounded, I think, by people's cleverness and flexibility, because you're kind of giving them a sort of impossible task. And weirdly, they can kind of do it.
That sounds like any journey with me and my wife in the car with the map, except it's the same map, but we still have the same challenges.
Yeah, and the classic, of course, is that you look at the map and you look at the world outside, you think, these do not seem to be the same. What am I supposed to do now?
But we get there eventually. I mentioned earlier on, and it's so important, and it's one of the foundational elements of the book as well. There was two things. There's the iceberg metaphor, but there's the now or never bottleneck. And this is where I was alluding to the limited memory that we have and the need to use information as quickly as possible in order to keep in flow, even in a dialogue like this, because we hum and haw and we buy ourselves time on a consistent basis. There's a lot in this, but I'd love you to take us through it.
Yes. So one of the things that we completely unaware of normally is just how limited our sensory and sort of auditory memory is. So, for example, the sound that we produce disappear within about a tenth of a second, which is just incredibly short-lived. And so we have to do something with the speech signal right away. But then on top of that, people speak really fast. So on the one hand, sound disappears almost instantly, yet people produce about up to 150 words per minute, and that's incredibly fast. And then in addition to that, not only is the sound very short-lived and we speak really fast, but our memory for combinations of sounds are really short-lived. So there's a classic experiment from the 1960s where people were presented with just 4 non-speech sounds. So say a tone, a hiss, a buzz, another tone. And all they had to do was just remember the order of that. And they couldn't do it. And so it's amazing that we can even understand anything. So what we have to do, so we call this under sort of the now or never bottleneck, because you have to deal with the input as you hear it. You can't just wait. And of course, we all experience this in some sense, that if somebody is talking to us and we get distracted just for a few seconds, then it's all gone. And so what we have to do, we and others have suggested, essentially we have to sort of chunk the input as quickly as we can. We have to sort of form a unit. And maybe I can sort of provide an example of how we do this sort of intuitively without even thinking about it. So if I was to, so I'm going to do a little test with you here, Aidan. So I'm going to read some letters for you, and then I want you to say them back to me when I say go. Okay, you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. T-N-A-V-I-O-N-O-I-N. Go.
TNA VOI VOIA. I think.
Pretty good. That was pretty good. It's tough because there's quite a lot of letters. So normally there is this limitations on our memory, which is about 4 to 7, depending on which psychologist you talk about. But let me give you another chance here, because this is the innovation show. So I want to give you another chance here.
Okay.
So, innovative. Okay. I-N-N-O-V-A-T-I-O-N. Go.
INNOVATION.
Right, amazing. How did you do that? What did you do? How did you manage that? That's the same. It was the same number of letters as before, but somehow you could remember all of them. What did you do?
So I chunked. I found a pre-stored pattern, and that's how. I tried to do that actually by the first time. I was trying to make a pattern out of it. I was trying to chunk the information, and I just failed.
But actually, what you did in the first one, you actually did chunk it into sort of about a 4-letter chunk, which is sort of roughly what you can do. So you were on the right track. But of course, what is important about the second one is that you already know the word innovation, and that allows you to take all those letters, chunk them together so they're one unit, and then that sort of allows you to sort of keep that in memory more easily. And so what we're suggesting is we're doing something very similar when we are processing language in real time. Now, of course, we're not thinking about it in the same way that you're thinking about the letters, but we're doing it automatically. And we're doing that at different levels. So we're doing it at individual sounds, at word combinations, and even at higher level until we sort of have some sort of representation in our minds of the meaning of what is being said.
I thought, and maybe you'll build on this, because I think this is, again, so important for our audience as well. And one of the way I think, and why I like to read eclectic range of books and write them, I write as much as possible, as close to after reading them as possible, is because I use metaphor to try and transmit complex thoughts or complex concepts, particularly when it comes to innovation. And I think this is one of the things that's often overlooked with organizational change as well, is that if you can find a pre-stored pattern for somebody and kind of go, this is like that, then people go, oh, is that all it is? And it's such a foundational element. And I mentioned to you before, George Lakoff was on the show talking about metaphor. it's so important for learning.
I mean, the Lakoff's perspective is quite important to the way we've been thinking about these things, actually. So I think the general idea that the mind has kind of deep theories about how the world works, like, for example, deep grammars or deep understanding of human nature or deep physics. That's an idea actually that's very popular in the psychology and the cognitive sciences. But the Lakoff perspective and our perspective too would be that's really the wrong way to think about it. What we're actually doing when we're understanding the world, whether it's understanding a new chunk of language, or understanding what someone's doing, or understanding the way an organization is changing, is we're making much shallower but analogical connections. We're thinking, this pattern here, I've seen that before. It looks a bit like that pattern. And so you're making these kind of lateral connections between one case and another case and another case. It goes back to our conventions. So the conventions in language through your process of charades are being created by relating one convention to a previous one you had already, and that might be related to another one. What you're not doing is saying, let's step back from all of this and create a deep system. The perfect, as it were, the perfect language which will solve all communicative challenges. Or if it were, say you're dealing with understanding organizations, you might think, what we really need is the ultimate theory of organizational change. We need to have a set of principles which explain how it all works. And if we only had that, it would be great. Well, that would be great. No one has that. But it's okay, because we are able to map the current challenge, the current problem, onto things we've done before, which we have done kind of quite well. So we can make that mapping and then cope with the present. And this sort of process of continual improvised coping is what we're doing, at every scale really in human life. But we're certainly doing it in the case of language. You don't have to have a complete theory of every aspect of English. And in fact, I mean, none of us, we're all fluent English speakers, and Morten is probably at least as fluent as I am, though not a native speaker, slightly embarrassingly for me. But none of us could write down a grammar of English. In fact, the best approximation to the grammar of English written down is a gigantic book by I've lost one of the names, Pullum, and another very famous linguist, and I've somehow forgotten who. And it's a wonderful book, and it's more than 1,000 pages. And it's extremely detailed, and I don't know any of it. It is an explicit level, and I couldn't reconstruct it. I'm not clever enough to reconstruct it. And even then, it's full of gaps and holes. Not because English is inevitably continually changing thing. But it's okay. I don't have to have that theory. All I have to have is lots of experience of practical communication, which will allow me to cope with the next practical challenge. And I think that's the way that the brain is always skimming on the surface, coping with a world that's far too complex to really have deep theories about, but it's not too complex to have analogies and to create metaphors for. And that's essentially the thing that allows us to cope with a world that's so complex.
So that leads us nicely to something you alluded to there, which is, and I loved how you teed this up and you used a metaphor here. You said it was like the Toyota just-in-time strategies, and the same way our brains do that. And, one of the things that doing the show on a regular basis does is it does teach you to be a better listener. But I often feel guilty sometimes, because you'll say something and I'll kind of go, I must ask the guys about that. But so I don't lose the flow of the conversation, I don't write it down. So I have to hold it there somewhere. And as a result, I'm probably not as active as a listener as I could be. But your book kind of made me forgive myself a bit, because you're kind of going, you kind of have to be. Because one of the guests we had on the show before was a guy called Julian Treasure. And he wrote a book called How to Be Heard. And he found it so interesting that it's one of the top TED Talks of all time. It's not how to speak, it's how to be heard. And he talked about this strategy that we use called script writing, is what he called it, where you're speaking and I'm writing down in my mind straight away what I'm going to say next. And most people do that, and they can't actively listen. It's a very difficult skill to master, but as you say in the book, we kind of have a reason for that, and that goes back to the magical number 7 ± 2.
One of the things that people have discovered in sort of analyzing interaction between people across languages and cultures is that we actually do it incredibly fast. So across cultures, across languages, on average, that's about a quarter of a second between one person finishes their turn and then the other person responds in some way. And that means that you actually have to start planning what you want to say before the other person have finished what they say. So one of the things that we have to do sort of very quickly as we're listening to one another, so figuring out, is the other person asking a question? Are they making a statement? Are they asking us to do something? And then as soon as we have to sort of figure out in what they're trying to say, and then we have to start formulating our response, because I mean, just formulating a response, if I was to show you a picture of something and you just had to name what it is, say I show you a picture of a cat and all you have to do is say cat, that takes you about 600 milliseconds. So what that means is that you actually have to start even, beginning to sort of program how you're going to move your mouth around to produce the sounds that we use to speak before I'm done talking. And so that's why sometimes it can be good sometimes to sort of take a moment before you answer, just if you want to sort of really take into account what the other person is saying. But under normal circumstances, if we're just shooting the breeze and so on, that's how quickly we talk. But on the other hand, it is, of course, as we are talking, we're also building up over time an understanding of what the other person is saying, what we are going to be saying, and so on. And of course, that's going to be helpful as well. But it is a challenge, and it's something I think we can all become better at.
Yeah, I think that the point about speaking from the point of view of the listener, so the how to be heard thing, I think is very interesting and very, very much connects with the perspective of the book, because going back to the message in the bottle point, if you think you're just sending out a message in a bottle, you think you've got to create a nice, clear message, and you look at it and you think, oh, I totally understand my message. I've said that beautifully. Off it goes into the bottle and off it floats off into the sea. And anyone who picks it up, it's their jolly fault if they can't understand me. I've said it clearly. And of course, that's completely wrong. If you imagine playing charades with someone who doesn't know a particular film or never heard of a particular book, and you think, well, I just can't understand why they're not getting it. Well, the answer is, they're the wrong generation, right? They weren't around in the sort of 70s, so they don't know about this movie or TV show or whatever. So how on earth are they going to get it? You need a different strategy. So if you don't take that viewpoint, then you're kind of doomed to fail. And I think one of the problems, so I think it's really critical, is a sense of what do I share? What do the audience and the speaker share? And that's got to be the basis. You can't do anything that you don't share with your audience. You can't afford to trade on it, because you're going to get absolutely nowhere. And I think one of the problems we have as speakers is it's very hard to get out of the mindset of thinking that we all know the same stuff. That by default thinking there's just stuff. Everybody knows this stuff. It weirdly happens to be the stuff I know, but it must be common to the humanity at large. And clearly that's nonsense. But we know it's nonsense. But in practice, when we're in the process of communicating, I think we often throw that out the window. And of course, you see that a lot with thinking about sort of corporate communications. You'll often get sort of grand speeches from the point of view of the company. In fact, I can remember an example. I won't go to the organization, but an organization I know very well. There was a sort of a new person taking over, and a kind of grand speech about how we're going to drive forward. And the driving forward was obviously going to be very problematic for about a quarter of the people. They had a kind of, it's all about being world class, blah, blah, blah. So if you're thinking, I'm not so sure I'm world class, then that looks like I haven't got a place in this organization anymore. What's going to happen to me? So I remember the person who was making the speech saying afterwards, I just can't understand it. People just seem to be getting on board with this. Well, that's because quite a large number of them are thinking, this could be disaster. This could be the end of my career. And what's going to happen to me? It's going to be a total hell to work here. And yet, from the chief executive's point of view, his own perspective is, driving off into the happy, sunlit future. What could be wrong with that? It's like, well, everything. If it's not obvious to you as an employee, how on earth are you going to fit into this world? So that's a kind of extreme example, but maybe we fall into this trap all the time. I think just not taking the time to think carefully about who's on the other side of this conversation. What do they care about? How do they understand the world? What are their priorities? Oh wow, they may be a bit different from mine. Well, yes, that's almost always the case.
Thank you for saying that, because it's one of the real problems when it comes to transformation is a clear articulation of a vision, or even from the innovator's perspective. Many of our audience are heads of innovation or heads of transformation, and we will know clearly what the future holds or the new business model, whatever it might be. But we'll often do the same thing as that CEO you mentioned, kind of going, they just don't get it. They're dinosaurs. They're stuck in the past. And when I have this saying is, when you point the finger, there's 3 pointing back at yourself. You got to start with those, because am I just sending out the message in the bottle and actually not tailoring it, like Morten said, for the audience? And this brings us nicely to Wittgenstein, who you mentioned many times throughout the book, and his idea of contextualizing the language, or situational language and situational communication. This is essential when it comes to the language game.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the language game, that this phrase, of course, is a Wittgenstein phrase, and we're not tying it directly to his usage, but that's where the whole idea of languages games really started. And so Wittgenstein has this kind of imaginary scenario where you have one person's helping another in some sort of building task, and they just say things like, slab, and I know, nail, hammer, or whatever it is. And again, going back to our message in the bottle thing, if I say slab, you might think, well, that's a pretty useless message. I mean, just what am I supposed to do with a slab? Of course, in a practical situation, it may be obvious. Well, I need the slab now. It's time to I put the cement down. Time to put the slab on top. Or nail might be, I need a nail, or it might be that this nail is broken. Right? It could mean all sorts of things. But the key is that the people involved in a dialogue are doing something together. They're doing a thing, and if they understand what that thing is, then they can use language fluidly to help them coordinate their behavior. So that's ultimately what language is trying to do. It's helping us work together, and allows humans to do complicated collaborative things that no other creature on the planet can do. But that ability to do things together effectively requires a common understanding of what it is we are doing, because then it's obvious that when I mention slab or hammer or whatever, oh yeah, I'm in the middle of this. We both know I'm trying to do this thing. You're trying to help me. Therefore, the obvious interpretation is this or that. But if we don't have that common understanding of what the task is, then we're in real trouble. I think in organizations, this is often the case. So essentially, the CEO is saying slab, and people are thinking, well, I don't really know what we're trying to do here. What do you mean in practice? So, what am I supposed to do next? So they have no real sense of, and it's not perverse awkwardness. It's they simply don't know what it is they're supposed to do. I mean, for an example that you hear a lot in different variations, but the general spirit of it is we must be more, and this is very relevant to the show, of course, innovative and perhaps risk taking. And if I'm listening to this from the top, I'm thinking, well, what does innovation and risk taking mean for me? Does that mean I bypass a few corporate procedures and don't worry about that? Or I mean, is that good or is that terrible? Am I going to get totally hammered? So as soon as I try and do anything, I run into some kind of barrier. Should I think, well, just don't worry about that. That's just throwaway experience and just have a crack at doing something totally different? Or am I going to get totally hammered if I do that and it doesn't work? When people are talking about risk taking, does that mean that if I take a risk and it fails, I'm going to be supported? Or does it mean in practice, I'm not going to be supported? I'm going to be told that was an idiotic risk to take. So I think perhaps the risk taking, I'll leave to somebody else. Nobody really knows. And because they don't know, it's like trying to build something together, but we don't know what we're trying to build and quite how it's supposed to look. And if you don't communicate that sense of what our task is and how we're going to be working together, so everybody's on the same page on that, then each individual communication is going to be taken. It may not be understood at all, but also it can also be viewed with great suspicion. So people can even hear and understand the message and still think, well, that's what they're saying. What does that mean in practice? I'm going to wait. I'll be that dinosaur. Just I'm not going to scurry out and start trying to make a change, because I might just make the wrong change, and then I'll be sorry. And I think anyone who's worked in a large organization of any kind has a sense of just how difficult it is to know what the rules really are, what you're really supposed to do. So I think this is that sense that we're using language. Language is a sort of game, but also it's embedded in the larger game we're playing, the kind of interactions and common endeavors we're engaged in. If we don't have a common understanding of those, the communication is never going to be very easy.
And by considering just the fundamental collaborative nature of language, that's where the notion of metaphor that you mentioned earlier becomes very important, that you need to think not so much about what you want to say, but how can you make other people understand what you're trying to get across. And I think oftentimes we think too much about what I want to say and the point I want to get across, which of course is important, but really trying to do sort of audience design, audience recognition, sort of figuring out how can I express this in a way that makes sense, given that the audience might be coming from very different sort of perspectives than where I'm coming from. And certainly if you're coming into a new organization, you're talking to them, it's very important to have some idea about what will my words mean for the people I'm talking to in this particular organization and so on. I think oftentimes maybe there's not enough thought or emphasis put on that, even though I'm sure people try.
I love that. And I just thought of a way to kind of bring these together. One of the things being that, we were saying about the different colors. So pale blue, light blue, and then Greek having a different word for both of those. And I thought also about how so one of the things the researchers did there was they had scanners on people's brains, so fMRI scanners. And I was like, imagine doing that for a change initiative and announcing the big change and see how different people's amygdalas light up, because they will perceive it very differently. Some people will get excited, and probably that population of people who get excited will be very small. But then I thought about the flip side, which is to your point earlier, Nick, about the CEO and the organization communicating the change, is that as that communication gets passed down the layers of the organization, it probably gets muddied. And that's a nice link to the telephone game that you talk about in the game and all in the book. And also even the images, as people sketch the images over time. And I won't spoil it, I'll let you guys tell the story. But one image, one animal becomes an entirely different animal as it's passed down through different levels of generations, essentially.
The study that you're referring to with the pictures, what he had people do there was first he showed them essentially a hieroglyph, an Egyptian hieroglyph of an owl, and then he had people reproduce it. So they saw the owl for a short amount of time, and then they had to sort of try to draw it, and then and that whatever they drew would be given to another person that saw that new drawing and then had to reproduce it, and so on and so forth. And over time, what happened that the owl, the hieroglyph, turned into essentially a picture of a cat, which was sort of it's kind of neat when you see all of them together. You can sort of see gradually sort of morphs into a cat. Now he did another version of it that sort of that's sort of relevant for sort of for organizations, perhaps, is that where you can see how the background culture that individuals have can influence the message they perceive. So what he did in this context is that he told, these were just undergraduate students, I think at Cambridge or something like that, that they would be told a story taken from an anthropologist's sort of collection of stories from the United States. So these were sort of Native American stories. And there was one story about two Native American, they were going on a hunting trip and so on. And so what he had, people listened to this, or they think they either listened to or they read the story, and then they had to reproduce it themselves. And then whatever they would write down would be given to another person, and so on and so forth down the line. And what happened is that it's essentially just turned into essentially a hunting story where somebody kills somebody else. So all the sort of the general ghostly and sort of spiritual elements of it that they didn't make sense to them, just disappeared from the story. So very much you can imagine the same might happen in an organizational context where there might be all sort of general ideas that are laid out from the top, and then as it goes down through different layers, it turns into essentially what people at different layers might consider given what they know before. And so it's important to sort of keep in mind when you're beginning to present information, what the sort of background perspectives of individuals are, because that's going to change things as it goes, that message moves through the organization.
An anecdote on that is that a very large retailer in the UK, who I used to know well, had internally the view that if they wanted to propagate any message across the entire organization, well, their maximum was 3 messages a year. So they said we can only conceivably communicate 3 things to our whole staff. We're kidding ourselves. We think we can do more than that. And they also said they've also got to be messages you can formulate as if you're writing a Sun headline. And that's not to talk down to their workforce. It's just that if it's not simple, it won't get transmitted. So people need to be able to remember it and say it to each other and say, oh yeah, but we're supposed to be doing this, aren't we? So it might be, like keep your queues down to no more than 2 people, or it might be something about restocking, or whatever it is. But it's got to be simple, and you can't have more than 3 a year. So that's it's a rather rare case where an organisation was extremely aware of this fundamental limitation. But many organisations spend their entire time deluging their poor employees with endless memos and updates and new policies, and as if you've got limitless ability to deal with all this stuff, and cascade this down to your team and think, oh, good grief, as a manager, you think, oh heavens, how am I going to handle this massive information and somehow help everybody understand it. So I think we need to be really, really sort of realistic about what it's possible for us all to grasp. And if you think about political campaigns, of course, the most effective political campaigns, it's sort of a sad fact, but it's just a reality, is that the most effective political campaigns have extremely few ideas in them, often one, and a handy message, a handy slogan or 2, but usually 1. And that's sort of the sweet spot, because if you're going to transmit in such a way that people can pick up the idea and tell their friends and neighbours, and the thing's going to actually not get lost. So we're not going to have the problem of the war of the ghost story that Morten mentioned, where all the nuance gets lost. You've got to find the core and think that's the thing I want to transmit, and just stick to that. So I think it's really very interesting just how little we can successfully propagate across large numbers of people. If we're going to try and convince a lot of people of anything, we better choose the target really, really carefully.
It's a nice segue for the idea of new machines from old bricks as well, where you talk in the book about how maybe we probably should mention Chomsky and Pinker as well, and how you view their theories versus your own theory. And maybe we'll do it in this way, where you say, essentially, you take Darwin's theory of evolution and you go, we adapted and therefore we were able to speak. But what you say is actually language adapted to us. The way I saw it was kind of like Michelangelo's block of stone, and in there was a statue, and over time you chipped away to make it suit your needs, or everybody's statue was different depending on their context and their various colors of blue, because maybe the ocean had different colors of blue, and therefore I needed a different color for a light blue versus dark blue to indicate depth or whatever it was. And these are important theories to understand, because when you juxtapose them with your theory, you can see the departure that you're making with the language game.
The general idea was that somehow we had built into our brains over time, evolution had endowed us with knowledge of language that would constrain how languages would be formed. So it's kind of sort of almost like a set of rules or a template for languages that would be highly constraining. The problem is that from an evolutionary perspective, that it's not easy to see how you would actually get there. And so the focus from Pinker's and Chomsky's perspective is that, why is the brain so well adapted for learning language? And so what we are trying to do in the book is sort of turning that question upside down, is sort of asking, why is language so well adapted to be learned by human brains? And then we're actually borrowing from Darwin himself. He does suggest in his book, The Descent of Man, that languages themselves are sort of the words, the phrases, the various structures are sort of competing with one another to be used more. And we see that in language change across time. Languages change very, very quickly across time. So, for example, it took only about 7,000 years for 2 languages as different as Danish and Hindi to evolve from a common ancestor. Yet today, somebody speaking Danish like myself, have a hard time understanding Hindi and vice versa. They're very different in the language, both the sounds, the structure of the language, and everything is very different. But on the flip side, biological evolution is incredibly slow by comparison. So it took So we're talking about millions of years or hundreds, thousands of years. And so from that perspective, languages became essentially, or rather forms a moving target for natural selection that natural selection can't sort of catch up with. And so it makes more sense for languages themselves to adapt to whatever pre-existing constraints that comes from the way our body works, the way our brains work, the way our thought processes work. And that means that across cultures, as humans sort of spread out throughout the world and became isolated from one another, different languages would gradually emerge across time because, as you were saying, so in some places they needed to talk about color of this. Other places, color didn't really matter. That's why some languages maybe only have 2 colors, whereas English has about 9 color terms, for example. So, and so that kind of change in the languages themselves is what drive the flexibility and the sort of collaborative use of language.
And just to add to that, the sort of Chomsky-Pinker perspective, and there are differences between the two of them. But their starting point, as Morten says, is that the structure of language, its sort of abstract form, is built in as kind of a blueprint for how languages have to be. And there are lots of variations, but they're all variations within that blueprint. And the 2 things they want to explain, and many, but the two most important ones are, as Morten indicated, why are we so good at learning languages? So the answer to that was, well, it's sort of built in. I mean, apart from the tweaks, we just have basically the abstract structure of language is just wired into our heads. That's supposedly the case. And the other thing is, why do languages have these universal properties? So if you look across languages, there are some patterns, at least it appears to be, there are some patterns which are stable across languages. So the question is why? And of course, if you have this universal grammar wired into your brain and wired ultimately into your genes, then that would be an explanation. But neither of those stories really works very well. So Morten said something about why the idea that that we need an explanation for how kids can learn language so quickly. That isn't really necessary from our perspective because languages have shaped themselves around us. So what languages have evolved to be learnable. If language is hard to learn, I'm not speaking it. So kids are going to always prefer the ways of communicating which are easy to learn and use, and that's just going to drive the way languages are. And that will be true for every other cultural artifact too. So the successful tools are easy for us to use. Successful songs are easier for us to remember. And that's just an inevitable fact about the cultural evolution. So the mapping, the match between kids' learning abilities and the products that they're actually learning is just a kind of inevitable feature of the process of cultural evolution. But on the language universal side, the question of are languages really all the same? Now you might think, well, if we tell this story where charades is occurring independently and in different ways with different constraints in different parts of the world, then languages could be sort of infinitely varied. Well, that's not quite right. So first of all, they are incredibly varied. So many of the supposedly universal features that linguists used to think of as stable, mysteriously stable across languages are much less stable than you think. So as more linguists have looked at a wide variety of languages outside European tradition more carefully, these universals just keep breaking down. So you have languages which don't seem to have more than a couple of syntactic categories at all. You have languages with all kinds of crazy patterns of word order. You have languages with syntactic categories that don't exist in European languages or Indo-European languages at all. All kinds of complexity and strangeness. So really, the variety is great. But to the extent there isn't, you get similarities, then that's not surprising because the communicative challenges we're facing are the same. So it's a bit like if you imagine looking at how people are doing charades for, dog across the world. In fact, it goes back to the Perlman study with the vocal charades too. For people around the world are able to do the same vocal charade for water or boiling the kettle or whatever. The reason is the world is imposing constraints on us. We need to communicate about these things that the world actually has in it that matter to us, which have particular properties. And so we're going to use the same sort of strategies. And also there are going to be things like the fact that if you want to communicate about a limitless number of things, you've got to recombine your existing charades. You can't just have a charade for every possible message. That's never going to work because you need to be able to deal with new messages. So you're going to have something like recombinable words with some kind of grammar. You can't avoid that. But that's not doesn't have to be wired into us. It's just an automatic product of the sort of charade creation process. So essentially it's our common humanity and the common problems we face that lead to similarities. But in truth, there used to be a kind of stylized fact about human language, which was that if you look really closely, you'd find all languages had all kind of hidden similarities and deep patterns. And I think the consensus in comparative linguistics, and this is not a field that either of us work in, but I think the consensus in comparative linguistics these days, i.e. looking at across different languages and comparing them, is that's just that perspective just evaporates the more closely it's examined.
And at the risk of being a bit of a man with a hammer and seeing nails everywhere, I thought about how, in the same way, as the need changes or the constraint is in place. If I'm all of a sudden as a leader of an organization saying we need innovation, I need to articulate why to an organization. I need to give them the why or the mission behind that in order for them to kind of go, now I get it. Now I can see why we even need a common language behind this thing to everybody to understand and be on the same page. But one of the things I thought I'd share with our audience is just to show how we have this ability to adapt is the beautiful diagram of cuckoo, baba, or booba. And I'm going to show it on the screen for our audience, and maybe you might elaborate on what it's about and the importance of it in your thesis.
Yeah, so this is a wonderful study that goes back quite a long time to a German scientist, Wolfgang Köhler, working in the Canary Islands, and he called it something different, but over time it's morphed into sort of two words, kiki and buba. And if you hear these two words and you look at this picture on the screen, if you were to guess which of these two shapes is called buba and which of these two shapes is called kiki, then most people would say that this spiky looking shape would be called kiki and the sort of blobby shape would be called buba. And that actually, if you have that intuition, then you share that with many, many people, not just English-speaking people, but people from Africa, people from India, and many other places. And even fairly young children will make similar kind of patterns. And this is sort of goes back to this notion that in the sound of words, there can actually be some clues to what they might mean. And so this has been studied quite extensively, and originally it was thought that the relationship between sound and meaning was completely arbitrary, meaning that that the sound of a word doesn't tell you what it means. And of course, this is true for many words. So if you have, say, the word for tree in English is called Baum in German, it's called træ in Danish, which is quite similar to tree. It's called arbre in French and so on. So there the sounds are very different. Nonetheless, there are some subtle aspects of the sound that nonetheless can still tell us something about the meaning of words. So, for example, one study that I was involved with, we looked at more than 6,000 different languages and found there was a number of sound that would indicate certain aspects of meaning, not sort of completely categorically, but they would sort of provide you a subtle clue that can be overwritten, of course, just like what we talked about earlier, that the language doesn't completely constrain what you can think. Likewise, the sound doesn't completely constrain what a word can mean. But nonetheless, there are these subtle clues that we can use. And in particular, it's been suggested that children can use this to sort of get into the language, figuring out that why all these adults, they're spewing all these sounds out all the time. And this can give you perhaps some handle on what the words might mean, and that there's actually might be a meaning for words in the language, or at least that they can be referring to something, even though it's not going to be a stable meaning, of course.
One of the things that's interesting is that, as Morten says, the assumption has been historically that there's no relationship between sound and meaning, they're completely orthogonal. And that isn't right. There are all these patterns. But on the other hand, it is interesting how loose that is. I mean, you might think, well, why don't we all have the same word for dog, which is just woof? And so you could imagine that we just stick with some sort of iconic representation, and that every language would be kind of there'd be a woof and a woof and a bow wow or something, but they'd all be roughly the same. But that's not right. And our colleague and collaborator Padre Monaghan, now at Lancaster University, had a very interesting insight into why that is the case and why there's this semblance of arbitrariness. And the idea is that if you have words where the sound and the meaning are very tied together, then you have a lot of trouble when you are in a situation where the contextual clues are giving you clues about the meaning of what's being said. So I'm pointing to something and say, "Oh, can you get me to such and such?" And you're thinking, "Well, it's got to be a cup or a mug or a beaker, or because we're in the kitchen." So the contextual cues are going to be clues about meaning. But if all those things, if cup and mug and beaker and saucer all had similar sounds, then we're in trouble, because which is it, right? So imagine they all have they're all sort of cup or cug or cud or something. This is like disastrous, because now we just can't tell the difference. So what you want is that the meaning information is sort of like separated, is all sort of orthogonal from the actual sound information, because the meaning information is what you're getting from the environment, and you need the sound information to pick out the specific case. So another example would be if you're at the dog show, then if you had all those if every breed of dog was a basic variation of woof, then when you wanted to actually just say, "Oh, that's my favorite type of dog," you'd be in terrible trouble, because people will be saying, "Oh, which woof was that exactly?" So you want to have Dachshunds and Poodles and Great Danes with totally different names. So there's an automatic sort of evolutionary process, a sort of cultural evolutionary process, to try and drive the meanings and the sounds of words actually to be quite independent. And that process is what leads to this apparent arbitrariness. And what the work that by Morten and many other colleagues, including Padre, has shown is that even though that's true, there's a kind of deep imprint of connectedness nonetheless. There's these clues that never get quite eliminated that mean that there are always these subtle relationships between sound and meaning. But there's a pressure against it. A language, if you made up a language which tied sound and meaning together, it's going to fail pretty badly.
Yeah, in fact, there was in the 1700s, there was a guy called Wilkins who was trying to sort of come up with the perfect language where each individual sound, or in this case, letters, would map on to different aspects of meaning. But it was completely unusable, that language. Nobody could learn it. And he kept on making mistake when he was trying to use it. But it was sort of this idea of the perfect language that would sort of completely eliminate all the sort of messiness there is in real language. But the problem is that real language is messy because we are using it in the moment, collaboratively, to figure out. And normally it doesn't matter because we work together to figure out what we are trying to say. But if you try to sort of straitjacket it into a rigid system, that's just not going to work. It doesn't going to fit the flexibility of language as it changes as we use it to interact with one another.
Beautiful. And I have to say, Morten, I was envious of the time you spent in the Santa Fe Institute. We had on the show, I don't know if he was director when you were there, but George West was on the show.
Oh, yeah.
Jeffrey West was on the show. We did a 5-part series on his book Scale, which is a magnificent book on emergence and complexity theory. We also did an 8-part series on the life of D. Hock, who was the founder of Visa, and his concept of K-order, which was very close to the hearts of those in the Santa Fe Institute. But I love the concept of emergence of language, that it emerged over time, and that we, I just had this concept of whittling a stick, or, the drawing out the sculpture from the stone, that over time that we adapted it and we made it fit to our needs, whatever culture or context that we're in. But one of the studies that you mentioned in the book was baboons recognizing language as well, recognizing the structure of words. And I thought that was fascinating. Maybe you'll share a bit about your experience in Santa Fe Institute and indeed the idea of language as an emergent quality.
Yeah, that was a truly amazing time. I spent sort of 9 months there on sabbatical, and it's a truly amazing place where you go to different talks. So one day you learn about the Krebs cycle, which is sort of the chemistry of life and so on. And then other times you hear about economics. Then you hear about something or from Los Alamos about physics. So you get your mind stressed in all way, but everything is sort of centered around the notion of emergence, that structure can self-organize, whether that's in economic systems, whether that's in language, whether that's in ecology. And so this notion that underlies the much of the work at the Santa Fe Institute is this notion of self-organization at different levels in different systems, and how we can study it and how we can learn from looking across different areas, different domains, where you bring people together who normally would never see each other because of the way we are sort of situated at, say, universities or in companies, but actually bring people together and sort of start understanding how we can use this notion of emergence and self-organization to understand things like language, things like, the economies or ecologies, as it were. And
actually, an interesting example of emergence, which is very core, really, to that perspective on science, really, and not just in the context of language. This idea that complex structures emerge, as it were, from below, is the astounding observations in Nicaragua and schools for deaf children in the 70s and beyond. So the sort of starting point there was that children who had profound deafness were put into special schools with the intention of teaching them to learn vocal language, essentially by lip reading. So the idea was that they would be able to speak Spanish. And this was pretty profound failure. It didn't work at all well. But what it meant was, this is not the intention, but what it meant was that you had lots of kids who were not able to communicate through vocal language, because that was not working, and they didn't have a common sign language either. So they had to get along. They were with each other 24/7 for months and years. So what do? What they did spontaneously in this extraordinary emergent way is create a language, which is now called Nicaraguan Sign Language, and that language it's a pretty complex language. It has a fairly large vocabulary, not as large as English, which is a ridiculously large vocabulary language, but a pretty substantial vocabulary and a complex grammar, and essentially what is now called a phonology. You might think of phonology, that's about sound, isn't it? But you have an equivalent of that in the context of the sign language. And the sign language is not at all, for people who are outsiders of the sign language world, obviously I am too, but if you're very far outside, you might think, well, sign language is going to be sort of iconic. It's kind of making gestures which kind of represent the thing that you're thinking about quite directly. But that's not really right. That's often the way things start. So a sign for tree or dog or something might have some resemblance to a tree or a dog, but that soon gets stylized and simplified very, very quickly. And that stylization means that you're creating something essentially which is a symbol. And the patterns and sequences in which those symbols are used become more and more standardized in exactly the way that you'd expect if you're seeing language as a kind of layered charade upon charade. And you get something within a period of a decade or two, which looks really like a natural language, just a regular language. And that's been created from scratch with nobody intending it. No one's trying to create a language. They're just trying to communicate moment by moment. They're just trying to get messages across of direct and immediate import. But that's forcing the creation of a richer and richer communicative system. Now, when that was originally discovered, the assumption was, well, this shows that really proves the Chomsky-Pinker universal grammar story, because look, these kids are just creating a language from nothing, so they must have it built into them. And of course, our starting point would be to say, no, that's completely the wrong way to look at it. What you should be seeing is that this is an example of the amazing charade playing origins of language in action. And that's happened multiple times. So that's happened there, but it's also happened in other communities as well. It happens to some degree when you have language contact. So if you have two groups of people with very different language, no overlapping language, who are in contact for prolonged periods. So Cook and Hausch were only in contact for a few days, but if you're having to work together for long periods, then you tend to get new languages appearing, which themselves have a complex, regular structure, just like every other language. So the ability to continually create new languages, either from nothing or by mixtures of old languages, that's just universal of human history, really. So language is this astonishing emergent phenomenon. It's a sort of a collective invention of amazing complexity, and none of us can invent our own language. I mean, people try to make up a language, you invent Esperanto or an Elfish language or whatever, or Klingon or something. But these are really just variations of languages that we speak already. And anyway, to the extent that they're not, to the extent that these artificial languages, like the one that John Wilkins mentioned that Morten talked about earlier, they just don't work very well. The languages that work are the ones that people just create without even trying. So in some ways, I think we'd see language as humanity's greatest invention. But ironically, it's not an invention any particular person invented or with any intention of inventing anything. We're just struggling to communicate. And then as a side effect, we create this amazing system, which allows us to transform what we can do.
And maybe you'll share, I think we'll start to land the ship, because one of the most beautiful stories you share in the book was in the 1800s. And the question you start off here is, imagine you're in darkness, you can't hear, you've lost your sense of smell, and you can't communicate in any sense. The only thing you have left is the sense of touch. And this is how a very young 2-year-old Laura Bridgman found herself. But it just shows you the resilience of the will to communicate, but also somebody gave her a chance and helped her communicate as well. And this led to a remarkable story. And it's such a beautiful story. And also, one of the reasons I wanted to share this was because she didn't get the credit she deserved, and she's kind of been lost to history a little bit. So I wanted to make sure that at least we can carry the story on and pass on the baton into the future.
I'm very glad you brought that up, because initially when I started to look at that story, I was looking at Helen Keller, which of course it was sort of similar situation, and whom everybody knows today. But Laura Bridgman was actually the original Helen Keller, if you wish. So she was born to sort of a relatively poor family in New Hampshire, and due to illness that hit the whole family, she got, as you mentioned, blind, deaf. She lost her sense of taste and smell too around the age of 2. And she did have a few words before that, but then she completely lost them, and she was kind of lost in the sort of the darkness and lack of contact with people. But then somebody from the Perkins School of the Blinds in Boston heard about her case and brought her there. And what he did was to try to first teach her essentially to read. And this is very unusual, because this is actually a case of somebody whose entry into language is through reading, whereas most people learn first to speak and then they learn to read, or they learn to sign and then they learn to read. But in her case, what he did, he created these letters that were raised so you could feel the letters with your fingertips. And then he would sort of have the letter like B-O-O-K for book, for example, or other kinds of letters. And then she would sort of feel a book and she would feel the letters and so on. And then he would cut them up after she learned that, and she picked that up quickly. He would cut the letters so they would be separate, and then he would sort of randomize them, and then she had to put them together. That was really hard for her. She got very mad because she just figured out this other system. But then she learned that too. And then at some point, she got this insight that she could actually that she could combine letters in new ways to understand new things. And then once she got that, she learned fingerspelling, which is essentially where you make shapes in the hand of somebody else, and then they can, by feeling it in their hand, they can feel what the shapes are, because of course they can't see it, they can't hear it, and that actually allows you to spell out all sort of words and so on. And once she learns that, she kind of took off and were able to communicate with loads of things. And she was sort of like really wanted to learn all sort of new words. And she became very famous. So they had exhibition days at the Perkins Institute where people from all around would come to see her. And she would sort of talk to people using her fingerspelling. And she became so famous actually that one time when Charles Dickens came over to the US, he traveled around the US and he wrote about her in his travel logs, which was about his sort of tour around the US. And so at the time, she was one of the most famous women in the world, about, as famous as Queen Victoria at the time. Yet today, most people don't know of her. And so what happened was that over time, there was still a lot of interest in her at the Perkins Institute. So what was interesting that later on, she would actually teach Anne Sullivan to do the fingerspelling. And of course, it's Anne Sullivan who eventually sort of brought Helen Keller into the world of language by teaching her fingerspelling. And so it's sad that nobody knows about Laura Bridgman now. And part of it is that Helen Keller came from a wealthy background. She was prettier, and despite the fact that when Laura Bridgman was at her sort of height of her fame, girls around the U.S. would create little Laura Bridgman Laura dolls, where they would take the dolls, poke out the eyes, and then put a little green ribbon around, because that's what she would wear around her eyes, or she would wear sunglasses, Laura Bridgman. And so girls had these Laura dolls all over the US. But then today nobody knows about it. But what's important about this story is that it really shows the resilience of human language, that even in the absence of most of our abilities to express ourselves like we do normally, either by words or by sign, she was able to sort of get into language and communicate with the world. And it shows just how fundamental our drive to communicate is, but also the flexibility of human language, that even without the normal sort of channels of communication, sign or spoken language, she was able to live a relatively full life and and be able to communicate with everybody around her using fingerspelling. So it's a truly amazing story.
I absolutely love the story of Laura Bridgman. It's such a beautiful story of resilience and just human spirit, just how to make it through. But also I really love the idea of the man who took a bet on her and took an interest in her and changed her life. And, how an amazing impact that we can have on people's lives if we do things like that. But there's one last piece, and it was hidden in the epilogue, but I wasn't escaping me, guys. I wasn't letting it go. And I thought it was of interest to our audience, because we often cover artificial intelligence and machine learning on the show. And you talk about the impact of the singularity, and can language save us from the singularity? Maybe you'll say a quick few words about this.
Yes, I want to be reassuring here. So it's quite common now for people to worry that artificial intelligence systems, particularly GPT-3 and the large language models that are becoming so modish, and they are amazing, is somehow approaching human levels of intelligence. And I think when you think about the way human language actually works, you realize that's really not what's going on at all. So what humans are able to do is to play this charade-like game where we can take words and a situation and play around with the words and craft into the situation to communicate what we need to communicate. And that is something that is completely different from what these large language models are doing. So what they're doing is they're hoovering up gigantic amounts of text from the web, and they're sort of knitting it together for new purposes. So you ask it a question out there on the web, there's a lot of language. It'll fish out the language, weld it together very, very cleverly, pull you out an answer. But it's got no contact with the world. So the thing about language is it's a way, in a charades-like way of connecting reality around us with the symbols that we can use. But the world of these large language models is entirely internal to language. So it's like taking a soup of language, knitting it together in new ways. Connection to the world absolutely absent. So these models don't have any conception there's a world at all out there. In fact, what they're able to do is to, as it were, fool us that they're understanding about the world, but really they're just repurposing that language that humans have created already. So I think, although these models are truly incredible, they are by no means as disturbing as you might think. The idea that we're going to hit the singularity when suddenly AI becomes more intelligent than we are, that I think is far-fetched indeed, because the language models that we have that work well now don't work at all by connecting language to reality. But that's what humans are all about.
And I think a lesson also from the book is that the last thing we should do is to teach computers to play charades. Because then we might be in trouble.
If they can do it, we're in trouble. Absolutely. I hope they can. I think they'll find it pretty hard.
Guys, I have a quote that I pulled from the book. I have a practice of pulling a quote to finish the show from my perspective. And then I'm going to hand over to you maybe for your final message, that what you intended from this book. And before I give that quote, where can people find you if they want to find out a bit more about your work? I know you've co-authored and individually authored multiple papers and books of your own. Where can people find you best?
Well, for me and Nick, I point you to my other popular book, The Mind is Flat, which is a book not specifically about language, but about how cognition works. And of course, if you just put either of our names into Google, you'll get our websites.
Yeah, and me, you can also find me through Google, of course. And then I'm also the director of the Cognitive Science of Language Lab at Cornell University, where there's more about the work that I do.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to have them in the show notes as well. I'm going to give a final quote, and then I'm going to hand to each of you then to close today's show, not to put you on the spot. So I'll give you a bit of time to think and prepare, like we talked about earlier on, to script write while I give this quote. I absolutely love this. I pulled this and I just thought that it spoke to me and hopefully to our audience. You wrote, "Communication may be universal across species, but language is uniquely human. It is the fundamental flexibility of language combined with our built-in desire to communicate that allows us to play linguistic charades, whether through spoken words, manual signs, or even touch like Laura Bridgman. These repeated games of charades culminate in a spectacular diversity of languages that enable humanity to accumulate knowledge of all the things that language can express across generations. As we shall see, each language carries within it the seeds of further cultural flourishing. Our powers of endless linguistic improvisation provide the catalyst for the creation of human culture and society in all its dazzling variety." Beautiful. Over to you guys.
Well, all I'll add to that is that I think it really is. It's a unique psychological characteristics of humans, our amazing improvisation abilities and our amazing collaboration abilities that allowed us to create language. But language itself, once we've created it, has a momentum of its own, which has completely reshaped what it's possible to do. Without language, we wouldn't be obviously having conversations like this, writing books. We wouldn't be able to do interesting science and technology, build religions, create laws. Essentially, human culture is soaked with language in a way that we scarcely generally realize. And language is sort of fundamental to everything that makes us uniquely human.
And I think also on top of that, one of the things that I think is very important message of the book is that the sort of essential collaborative and improvisational nature of language. And if we take that into account when we are communicating with one another, maybe that can create better interaction and better understanding between everyone.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful message to finish with. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, authors of The Language Game, How Improvisation Created Language and Changed the World. Morten Christiansen and Nick Chater, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It's been wonderful.
I hope you enjoyed The Language Game. I want to thank our sponsor Next Estate, who specialized in the English language in the German market for buying, selling and managing property. You can find Next Estate at next-estate.de or next-estate.com. See you very soon.